We've heard a lot recently about COVID-19, which is a kind of virus. But have you ever wondered, what is a virus? A virus is a very small thing, ranging from maybe 20 nanometers to about 400 nanometers. To give you a sense of that size, the wavelength of a lot of red light is around 600 nanometers. That means that many viruses are actually smaller than the wavelength of red light. A virus is a protein or lipid capsule or shell, and the proteins may be on the surface, or they might actually be inside, and it has a little bit of nucleotide material inside of it, either DNA or RNA. Sometimes the shells are purely made of protein, while other times they may be made of something more complex, like a lipid membrane with protein sticking out of them. Now, a lipid is what's called a fatty acid monomer, so it's basically a kind of fat. Half of it, which is hydrophobic, and half of it is hydrophilic. Now, hydrophobic means that it hates water and likes to move away from it. However, hydrophilic means that it loves water and always moves towards it. So with these lipids, you typically have something called a bilayer, so that the inside and outside of the bilayer, well, that's going to be hydrophilic. And the inside of the bilayer, just the inside between those two sections, well, that's going to be hydrophobic. Sometimes a virus has its own proteins and enzymes inside of the cell to help them use the cell to make more viruses. A virus works by hijacking the cell's functions and using it to make more viruses. And what I mean by that is that the virus actually takes over the cell and uses all the cell's mechanisms to make more and more viruses. So, for instance, the viruses might take over a cell, say in your lungs. And then these cells will normally be producing all sorts of proteins and enzymes to help your lungs function. But what the virus does is it takes over that cell inside of your lungs and has it just make more viruses, which means it's not doing its job for your body anymore. And then what happens is it continues to make more and more and more viruses until that cell actually explodes. It's going to die. When it dies, all of the viruses inside of it are going to leave. They're going to explode outward. And these viruses are going to infect more and more cells until eventually the host dies. Now, all viruses have special instructions inside of them that tell the body how to make more viruses. Those special instructions come in the form of either RNA or DNA. When it's RNA, the RNA comes in something called a single-strand RNA, or SS plus RNA. This RNA can be directly transcribed into proteins, just like messenger RNA or mRNA in our body does. But it also can be used for the replication of new viruses. Lots of viruses are RNA viruses, such as COVID-19. Some viruses use DNA instead of RNA. In this case, the virus relies on the body to turn the DNA into RNA so that it can have the instructions to make all of the proteins necessary for the virus. It then also has to copy the DNA to make new viruses. Some examples of DNA viruses are things like smallpox or other herpes-like viruses. There are three main categories of DNA viruses: double-stranded DNA viruses, single-stranded DNA viruses, or pararetroviruses, which replicate their genome through an RNA intermediate. This means that in order for the viruses to replicate their DNA, they actually have to turn it into RNA first, and then it's copied from RNA back into DNA. How a virus replicates depends on the kind of virus it is. See, there are some viruses which are called single-strand RNA viruses, and these are very simple viruses. And they use this RNA inside of them to replicate more proteins so that they can make more parts of the virus, and then those RNAs themselves are also replicated to make new viruses. Some viruses are DNA viruses, not RNA viruses. Now, DNA is the instructions that you and I have, okay? And so these DNA viruses are distinctly different from RNA viruses. First, in order to make the proteins and enzymes that make up the virus, that DNA has to be translated into RNA itself. And then you can start making the proteins and enzymes. Also, the mechanisms for copying the DNA are different than the mechanisms for copying the RNA, so it has to use slightly different mechanisms in order to copy that DNA. And then there are special kinds of viruses called pararetroviruses. And these viruses actually have to have the DNA transcribed into RNA before it can be copied back again to DNA for future viruses. So what's the advantage of doing this? This multiple step process of transcription, going from DNA to RNA back to DNA, introduces a greater chance of mistakes or mutations. And for viruses, this is very important to allow them to escape the immune system within any body and be able to continue to replicate freely. Now, one question that has dogged scientists for years and years and years is whether or not a virus is actually alive. Sometimes you might hear that the definition of life has several properties. That you consume food, you expel waste, you reproduce, and you respond to stimuli. By this definition, a virus is not alive. But the definition also misses some very important key factors about life itself. In particular, it ignores the fact that life evolves and it changes as a result of Darwinian pressure. So we can also try and define life as something which undergoes Darwinian evolution. What that means is that the organisms from one generation to another will change in response to selective pressures like climate change. So by this definition, viruses are actually alive. Let's take COVID-19 for example. You see, in COVID-19 we have multiple variants of it. And what we mean by variant is that each new generation, each new kind of virus has changes in its nucleotides. And so it's changes in its RNA. And those changes result in changes in the proteins that are on the virus itself. And those changed proteins actually can make it harder for the body to recognize that as COVID-19 and destroy it. It makes it more difficult for it to use its antibodies to actually destroy them. And so what you're seeing here is that as COVID-19 infects more and more people, it's going to slowly change. It's going to slowly evolve. And this evolution is what is allowing it to escape our immune system and keep on infecting us over and over and over again. Because the older variants, the alpha variant, that we have all become exposed to either through the vaccination or earlier exposures, well, our body knows it. Our body's ready for it. And that has been eradicated by the immune system of human beings around the world. But the later variants haven't had that opportunity yet. We are not nearly as immune to those. So those remain around. And as soon as we become more and more immune to those variants, new variants are going to begin to show up because evolution is going to apply pressure, and those are the ones that are going to survive. Evolution impacts us in ways beyond just viruses. It goes even to stuff like bacteria. You see, bacteria can become immune or unresponsive to penicillin or other kinds of antibiotics. So if we overexpose some bacteria to some antibiotics, they can become immune to them. It will no longer work. A really classic example of this is actually tuberculosis, something that many people might think of or remember as consumption, right? This is when you cough and you might have blood in the handkerchief whenever you cough. This is an infection of the lungs. Now there's a certain kind of tuberculosis which is so contagious, and one of the biggest problems is we don't have any antibiotics that will be effective against it. That means that once you catch this tuberculosis, they don't know how to treat it. They can't get rid of it. And so people who have this particular variant of tuberculosis within the United States, if they find out that you have it, you're actually going to be taken into a quarantine facility. You're going to be locked away from everybody else until you get better. But the problem with tuberculosis is you may never get better. And so some of these people actually find themselves in these quarantine environments for years and years and years. And although it seems like it's cruel and it seems like it's awful, the simple fact is it's better to lock away one person than have this horrible, very contagious disease spread among the population within the United States and the world. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you learned something, and absolutely please like and subscribe if you like this for more content. I'll see everybody later. Thanks. Bye-bye. This has been a video from Van Cleef Scientific. If you like this, please like and subscribe for more content.